The industrial transition to wide bandgap semiconductors faces a hard physical limit in the chemical precursor supply chain. Trimethylgallium is the foundational organometallic precursor required to grow gallium nitride epitaxial layers for military radar and electric vehicle power electronics. Global demand is projected to expand at a compound annual growth rate of 12.4% through 2030. This trajectory will outpace global synthesis capacity by 2028. This bottleneck is compounded by extreme geographic concentration. China is on track to control over 67% of global production capacity by 2030, rising from just 15 metric tons in 2018. Western semiconductor fabrication plants remain entirely dependent on this highly localized chemical infrastructure. This vulnerability mirrors the monosilane supply squeeze of the early 2000s, which capped global electronics manufacturing for years. The barrier to entry for trimethylgallium production is not basic synthesis, but ultrapurification. Electronic-grade material requires 6N to 7N purity, meaning critical contaminants like silicon and oxygen must be restricted to fewer than 5 and 10 parts per billion. Crude synthesis yields a highly impure compound, with oxygen levels averaging 450 parts per million. To bridge this gap, chemical plants must run multi-stage vacuum fractional distillation. This energy-intensive process yields only 35 to 45% of the initial volume as electronic-grade material. Any metallic impurities exceeding 10 parts per billion cause deep-level defects in the gallium nitride crystal lattice. These defects reduce the breakdown voltage of power devices by up to 40%, rendering entire wafer runs useless. Downstream semiconductor manufacturing is locked into rigid physical consumption ratios. A single modern Generation 5 reactor running continuously consumes 3.2 kilograms of trimethylgallium per month to produce 1,106-inch wafers. While newer reactor designs have reduced the precursor cost per wafer from $110 to $68, overall volume requirements are scaling rapidly. A standard power semiconductor fabrication plant operating 150 reactors requires up to 5.8 metric tons of electronic-grade precursor annually. There is no software workaround or financial hedge for this material requirement. If the highly concentrated chemical plants in East Asia experience operational disruptions, global power semiconductor manufacturing will face immediate production caps. Long-distance transmission lines act as massive capacitors under light loads. This physical phenomenon, known as the Ferranti effect, causes dangerous voltage spikes at the receiving end of the grid. To prevent cascading equipment failure, transmission operators rely on oil-filled inductors called shunt reactors, but grid expansion plans have decoupled from manufacturing capacity. Lead times for utility-scale shunt reactors have quadrupled since 2018, rising from 12 months to 48 months. The structural supply deficit is projected to reach 15.8% by 2027. This bottleneck directly threatens the commissioning of over 45,000 circuit kilometers of planned transmission lines. This bottleneck is driven by extreme material intensity. A single 765 kilovolt shunt reactor requires 78 metric tons of laser-scribed grain-oriented electrical steel and 32 metric tons of high-purity copper. The production of this specialized steel is highly consolidated. Fewer than 10 mills globally can produce the grades required to minimize core losses. Copper requirements also scale nonlinearly with voltage. A 765 kilovolt unit requires 540% more copper by weight than a standard 110 kilovolt unit. This high material footprint exposes grid infrastructure directly to base metal supply chain volatility. Systemic impact of the shortage is a direct limit on the energy transition. Global demand for reactive power compensation is projected to reach 96,000 megavoltamperes reactive by 2028. Manufacturing capacity is growing at just 5.7% annually. This leaves a projected deficit of 29,000 megavoltamperes reactive. To prevent overvoltage failures, operators must either curtail remote wind and solar generation or run transmission lines below thermal limits. This physical constraint mirrors the grid crises of the late 1960s, when rapid high-voltage deployment outpaced compensation equipment manufacturing. Today, the physical limits of heavy industry again dictate the speed of policy ambitions. Replacing Russian pipeline gas requires expanding the Trans-Anatolian natural gas pipeline. But doubling volumetric flow through an existing 56-inch pipeline is governed by the nonlinear physics of fluid dynamics. To increase capacity from 16 to 31 billion cubic meters per year, operating pressure must rise from 75.5 bar to 95.0 bar. This pressure increase requires a massive expansion of physical compression infrastructure. A 93.7% increase in throughput demands a 164% increase in total installed compression power. The pipeline must scale from 128 megawatts to 338 megawatts of turbine power. This requires adding 4 new compressor stations along the 1,850-kilometer route. This infrastructure buildout is blocked by a severe manufacturing deficit in industrial gas turbines. Lead times for 30 to 50 megawatt mechanical drive turbines have expanded from 12 months in 2018 to 45 months in 2025. Only 3 original equipment manufacturers globally possess the capability to produce these specialized high-pressure rotors. This consolidation leaves pipeline operators competing directly with global liquefied natural gas export terminals for manufacturing slots. The cumulative backlog is projected to peak at 135 units by 2026. This structural constraint is analogous to the mid-1970s expansion of the Trans-Siberian pipeline network. Back then, European nations faced technology embargoes. Today, they face a physical manufacturing bottleneck. Even if the upstream pipeline achieves its 31 billion cubic meter target, downstream bottlenecks will limit European deliveries. The Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which connects Greece to Italy, is physically capped at 20 billion cubic meters per year. 11 billion cubic meters of the expanded upstream capacity is structurally allocated to the Turkish domestic market. This limits net new volumes to European hubs to a maximum of 10 billion cubic meters per year. To unlock even this limited volume, the downstream pipeline requires its own separate compression campaign across Greece and Albania. This requires installing at least 2 new 15-megawatt compressor units. Without simultaneous downstream upgrades, upstream expansion yields diminishing returns for European energy security. Global transition to lithium-ion batteries is bound to a highly volatile chemical precursor chain. Lithium hexafluorophosphate is the dominant electrolyte salt required for modern automotive battery cells. Global demand is projected to scale from 120 kilotons in 2020 to 560 kilotons by 2028. This rapid expansion forces a lockstep increase in the demand for high-purity phosphorus trichloride. The stoichiometric relationship is rigid. Producing 1 ton of the electrolyte salt requires approximately 0.9 tons of high-purity phosphorus trichloride. This drives the total precursor requirement to 504 kilotons by 2028. While nominal nameplate capacity suggests a buffer, actual operational capacity is severely constrained by localized chemical bottlenecks. Battery-grade electrolyte synthesis cannot utilize standard agricultural-grade chemicals. Producing 1 metric ton of lithium hexafluorophosphate requires 904 kilograms of high-purity phosphorus trichloride and 790 kilograms of anhydrous hydrofluoric acid. The synthesis is highly sensitive to moisture. Any water contamination above 10 parts per million triggers a destructive hydrolysis reaction. This reaction generates corrosive hydrofluoric acid and toxic phosphorus oxyfluoride. These compounds degrade battery electrodes and cause rapid cell swelling. Consequently, manufacturers must bypass standard agricultural supply chains. They must secure dedicated, electronic-grade distillation capacity with purity levels exceeding 99.999%. Geographic concentration of this chemical chain presents a severe systemic risk. China controls 72% of global electrolyte salt production and 68% of high-purity precursor capacity. North America and Europe combined represent less than 5% of global capacity. This leaves Western gigafactories entirely exposed to localized supply shocks and export controls. This bottleneck is reinforced by strict international regulatory frameworks. Phosphorus trichloride is classified as a Schedule III chemical under the Chemical Weapons Convention due to its dual-use potential. This classification subjects manufacturing facilities to rigorous international inspections and export controls. These regulatory barriers prevent rapid capacity scaling outside of established East Asian chemical hubs. The global sugar market experienced a structural supply shock in 2023. El Niño-induced crop failures in India and Thailand forced global buyers to rely on Brazil for over 60% of raw sugar exports. This sudden concentration of demand overwhelmed the logistics infrastructure of the Center-South agricultural region. The primary bottleneck is physical, terminating at the rail-to-marine export corridor of the Port of Santos. Peak rail-bound sugar arrivals reached 4.3 million metric tons in September 2023. This volume exceeded the port's maximum physical loading capacity of 3.0 million metric tons by over 43%. The resulting structural deficit accumulated a net backlog of 4.1 million metric tons of sugar over the 5-month peak harvest period. Average vessel wait times escalated from 6 days to 38 days. This bottleneck is structurally analogous to the Great Grain Robbery of 1972. In that crisis, sudden grain demand overwhelmed legacy rail-to-port corridors in the United States. Today in Brazil, the rigid physical limits of rail networks and marine terminals dictate global commodity flows. Financial engineering cannot bypass these physical constraints. The terminal infrastructure at the Port of Santos operates with virtually zero structural redundancy. During the peak harvest, the Copersucar and Tiplem terminals operated at 98 and 96% capacity utilization. This extreme utilization leaves no buffer for equipment maintenance or operational delays. The entire export corridor is highly vulnerable to minor systemic disruptions. Furthermore, raw sugar is highly sensitive to moisture. Loading operations must cease entirely during rain events to prevent product degradation. While the combined nominal loading rate of the 4 major terminals is 9,000 metric tons per hour, actual throughput is reduced by an average of 18% due to rain-induced halts. Static storage capacity across the 4 primary terminals is capped at 690,000 metric tons. This represents less than a 7-day supply buffer at peak export velocity. When rain halts loading, the rail-bound inflows quickly overwhelm local storage. The physical limits of these marine terminals create an immediate downstream barrier. The physical bottlenecks at Santos translate directly into severe financial penalties. The vessel queue in the outer anchorage peaked at 78 ships in September 2023. This backlog generated aggregate daily demurrage costs exceeding $2.34 million for the waiting fleet. Average daily demurrage rates for individual vessels rose from $18,000 to $30,000. This 66.7% increase in shipping costs was driven by an acute shortage of available spot tonnage. Because vessels were trapped in the Santos anchorage for weeks, global shipping capacity was artificially restricted. The resulting logistics premium was passed directly to the commodity markets. The physical supply bottleneck drove the local sugar export premium to a peak of 2.60 cents per pound over the New York futures contract. This localized infrastructure failure directly inflated global refined sugar prices. The Santos congestion demonstrates how physical transport limits, rather than market demand, ultimately set the price of global food supplies. Modern military radar and electronic warfare systems depend on a single synthetic crystal. Yttrium iron garnet possesses an exceptionally narrow ferromagnetic resonance line width. This physical property allows precise microwave filtering and ultra-low noise signal generation. The entire hardware pipeline is vulnerable to an extreme upstream bottleneck. China controls 88.5% of global refining capacity for high-purity yttrium oxide. The combined capacity of the United States and Europe is just 6.3%. Chemical purity dictates electromagnetic performance. Precursor impurities like silicon or iron exceeding 15 parts per billion degrade the resonance line width from 0.15 to over 0.80 oerstids. This degradation renders the resulting crystals useless for defense-grade applications. Midstream synthesis cannot keep pace with escalating military demand. Global demand for defense-grade yttrium iron garnet has risen 78.5% since 2018. This surge is driven by the rapid deployment of active electronically scanned array radars and wideband electronic warfare receivers. Simultaneously, manufacturing yields are collapsing. Qualified crystal boule yield rates have fallen from 42.5% to 27.5%. This decline is caused by increasing crystal size requirements and chemical variability in raw material lots. The divergence of these curves has created a severe procurement crisis. Average lead times for critical components have ballooned from 18 weeks to 64 weeks. This delay directly stalls the production of advanced fighter aircraft and naval radar suites. This bottleneck is highly resilient because single-crystal yttrium iron garnet is physically non-substitutable. It achieves an unmatched resonance line width of 0.15 oerstids. This enables an ultra-low phase noise of -130 decibels relative to the carrier per hertz. This extreme signal purity is critical for detecting low observable stealth targets. Alternative materials like barium ferrite exhibit line widths up to 300 times wider. This results in severe insertion losses and poor signal selectivity. Solid-state semiconductor alternatives also fail to match the tuning range and high-quality factor of this crystal. This material bottleneck mirrors the quartz crystal crisis of World War II. Today, the defense sector faces a rigid physical constraint with no viable solid-state bypass. Primary aluminum production depends on sacrificial carbon anodes. These anodes require high-purity green petroleum coke as a precursor. However, global oil refineries are aggressively upgrading coking units to maximize light transport fuels. This optimization shifts output toward low-quality, high-sulfur fuel-grade shot coke. The data shows a stark divergence. While total green coke production is projected to rise to 152 million metric tons by 2035, the anode-grade share will collapse from 45% to just 20%. Calciners are forced to blend inferior, high-impurity feedstocks. This structural shift degrades the physical and electrical properties of the final carbon anodes. This feedstock contraction translates directly into a structural deficit of calcined petroleum coke. Aluminum smelting requires a rigid stoichiometric ratio of 0.4 tons of calcined coke per ton of metal. By 2030, global primary aluminum production is projected to reach 80.2 million metric tons. This requires over 32 million metric tons of calcined coke. Available supply will cap out at 27.65 million metric tons. The resulting deficit of 4.43 million metric tons represents a 13.8% shortfall. Because there is no chemical substitute for carbon anodes in electrolytic cells, this deficit acts as a hard physical limit on global aluminum smelting capacity. Financial engineering cannot bypass this material constraint. Smelters using degraded anodes face severe operational and environmental penalties. Average sulfur content in calcined coke is projected to reach 3.5% by 2030, breaching historical limits. High sulfur anodes degrade rapidly in the electrolytic cell. This increases specific anode consumption by 13.6%, driving up power requirements and operating costs. Furthermore, sulfur dioxide emissions per ton of aluminum will nearly double to 28 kilograms. Smelters must invest in costly wet gas scrubbing systems to meet environmental regulations. This bottleneck is structurally identical to the 1970s energy crisis. Back then, refinery upgrades forced metallurgical industries to adapt to lower quality carbon inputs. Today, the aluminum sector faces the same rigid physical reality. Canada's primary maritime gateway to the Asia-Pacific region relies on a single, highly vulnerable rail corridor. The 137-kilometer transit through the Fraser Canyon handles over 140 million metric tons of bulk cargo annually. During the winter of 2023 to 2024, severe weather exposed the structural fragility of this link. In January 2024, major cold snap cut daily railcar deliveries by 58.4% to 520 cars. Consequently, the bulk vessel queue in the Strait of Georgia peaked at 54 ships. This represents a 200% increase over nominal non-winter baselines. The physical throughput of the Fraser Canyon corridor dropped to 40% of its rated maximum. This immediate restriction forced operators to ration railcars upstream. The bottleneck demonstrates how localized geographic disruptions propagate instantly into global maritime supply chains. This seasonal collapse is driven by a fundamental mechanical constraint in railway engineering. In extreme cold, the volumetric efficiency of train air brake systems degrades rapidly. Air compressors cannot maintain uniform pressure across long brake lines. This physical limitation forces operators to shorten trains to maintain safety margins. Under optimal summer conditions, trains run at 150 cars. Below -30 degrees, train lengths are capped at 70 cars. This physical reduction cuts total daily corridor capacity by 53.3%, dropping throughput to 98,000 metric tons. This bottleneck is concentrated in the Fraser Canyon segment. Here, Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City tracks run parallel on opposite canyon walls. There are no redundant bypass routes. When extreme weather strikes, the entire Canadian bulk export engine, is halved by the laws of thermodynamics. The long-term economic consequences of this structural bottleneck are compounding. Average vessel wait times for bulk carriers in Vancouver rose from 8.2 days in 2018 to 18.2 days in 2022. This escalation was triggered by cumulative network shocks, including the 2021 atmospheric river washouts. These delays impose severe financial penalties on global exporters. Average daily demurrage costs for standard Supramax and Panamax vessels rose by 96.5%. Daily penalties peaked at an average of $28,500 in 2022. Despite a partial recovery in 2023, wait times remain 104% higher than 2018 baselines. This persistence indicates a permanent loss of operational buffer capacity. This vulnerability mirrors the Canadian wheat export crisis of 1915 to 1916. Over a century later, the lack of geographic redundancy continues to cap the nation's export economy.